Yeah, and then I think we can roll. So thank you, everybody, for joining this conversation. Yeah, we are here as sort of as a group of academics and practitioners looking at the earthquake and the massive devastation that happened in Turkey and in Syria last week. Yeah, so I'm very grateful to see that so many of you have responded to our call and are joining this conversation. And of course, also we have some practitioners and some colleagues joining us from Turkey who have been affected and also very much engaged in the response. So thanks so much, especially to you, for making time for this. Of course, and I should say that's definitely for the researchers and academic side, we are not responders ourselves, but we have worked in crisis management, disasters, risk management and related fields also for decades. And we do think that now is the time to really put our knowledge and the skills and the methods that we have developed to good use. And that, of course, includes the 3 reports that we have written for the European Commission on strategic crisis management in Europe. And that's, so we would like to have now a free and open discussion about what has happened, what can we learn from this, and how we can now also contribute and work together moving forward. And maybe first of all, I would like to give the floor to our Turkish colleagues and also to the practitioners in the room to report, on how they have perceived the situation, on what is going on, and how you think, where are the greatest needs, especially what we can do from the academic community, or also how the EU can contribute, has contributed, and might better contribute. And again, this is an open and free conversation, so I'm trying my best to moderate, but please feel free to take the floor and just start speaking. It's not very choreographed. I think Mark, you're talking, but on mute. And I see Sibel. So maybe start with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm an industrial engineering professor in Istanbul, and I have been working on disaster preparedness and response logistics for about 20 years. First of all, I must say that this is a huge disaster. It's nothing like European countries have faced. There are many reasons for that. The earthquake was very impactful. And the building stock in the area. First of all, the earthquake affected a very large area, 10 cities in southeast Turkey, and some cities in Syria as well. There were 2 earthquakes, major earthquakes, and the building stock in that region and in general in Turkey, some of them are very old. They are usually these buildings with many apartment units. Some of them tall buildings like 16 floors, 15 floors. And most of these buildings were not in the best condition anyway. Some of them were already identified as weak, vulnerable, but for some reasons they couldn't be demolished and reconstructed to withstand an earthquake of this magnitude. In terms of response efforts, in Turkey, there's a centralized body of the governmental body called AFAD. They were in charge of everything. They are the coordinating body, actually. They have 25 units. They are responsible from coordinating governmental organizations, ministries, etc. Well, they were aware of the situation, and only a few people could reach the earthquake area in the early hours. They started the response operations, but many people think that they were slow to respond, especially in terms of the number of search and rescue teams. There was, of course, some problems with the infrastructure and the transportation network, the roads. One of the airports was damaged and couldn't be used, for instance. So people had a hard time reaching the cities, not to mention the rural areas, and the weather conditions on top of that were not good. It was very cold and so on, snowing and so on in some cities. Anyway, so the search and rescue continued, and it's still continuing, but of course they can save only very few people right now. And also the information flow was not reliable, I should say, even from the government side. First of all, they did not share much information, and they were updating the people on TV from time to time. But many things were uncertain. The damage, how many buildings collapsed, how many people were affected, what is the ratio of the buildings collapsed in these cities, for instance. So I think it was a bit hard for people that are not in the affected area to understand the magnitude of this huge disaster. And also the centralized government did not ask for any help from the NGOs and other organizations, and it was criticized that the military help was not asked for at the beginning. So Turkey has a huge capacity, military capacity that could have been utilized, for instance. So, I mean, I don't want to take too much of your time. So at this point, the search and rescue and the immediate response is over. There's a problem with shelter. I mean, there are so many homeless people. The number of collapsed and the collapsed buildings is, I think, in the whole area over 6,000. But there are much more damaged buildings, heavily damaged buildings. And even if people do not have damaged buildings, they do not want to live in that area anymore, at least for some time until full recovery. There are economic issues as well, but I think what we can help with at this moment is with the recovery operations. And as operations research academicians, we have been working on such problems. I think what is missing mostly is our work is, for instance, very analytical, quantitative, mathematical. Sometimes for research, we go into models and algorithms that are very complex. We need maybe simpler algorithms that will run fast and be implementable in practice, and some actual tools like decision support tools. So for many of us, for instance, for myself, we code the algorithms, we test them with some data, but they are not in a form to be used directly by practitioners at the moment. And also we need to gather data and so on, have access to data. Maybe I should stop at this point.
Thank you.
Burcu may continue.
No. Yeah, I think it was also a very impressive account. And then, of course, yeah, Burcu, or maybe also I see Mark and maybe Mustafa, because you mentioned also a couple of things that were going wrong and you said the NGOs were doing that or they were like too late. So I would also maybe like to give the floor to Mustafa and Mark to say how that, you know, and how you've experienced the earthquake and, for instance, the coordination difficulties, the lack of information, the logistics issues, and the decision-making problems. If you could maybe briefly comment, I don't know who wants to go first. And also then, of course, the situation in the two different countries. Yeah.
Yeah, I can go first. Our role is to support Red Cross national societies with data and digital products. So yeah, in that sense, our role is let's say modest, because the actual work is of course being done by the Turkish Red Crescent and the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, and then also ICRC. The Red Cross consists of many, let's say, parts, and also IFRC, so that's the International Federation. So these four, let's say, parts of the Red Cross are currently active in the response. And our role is to see if we can support them. So one way that we are trying to support them is with automated damage assessment. We have been developing over the last 4 years what we call a deep learning tool, where we then plug in images of before the earthquake and after the earthquake. And this automated damage assessment tool can then assign a damage label to each individual house. So this will give, let's say, a high level insight into which areas are most damaged. But there are, let's say, still limitations to this damage approach using satellite imagery. For example, in the first days or first hours after the earthquake, the satellite imagery was not immediately available, or there was a lot of cloud cover due to the bad weather. So we also had to wait till high resolution satellite imagery from, for example, Maxar became available with, let's say, less or no clouds. And only then we could start running these analyses. There are more organizations around the world doing this kind of analysis. So yeah, we also try to align. It also depends on how your model is trained. Most of the models around the world are trained on a XBD data sets. It's a data set from the Defense Innovation Unit in the US. But yeah, they don't have a lot of training data on Turkey and Syria. So that also means that the results will probably less, I would say, adapted to the context in Syria and Turkey, especially in Syria, where already a lot of damage was present due to the war. The outcomes of this model might be a bit less accurate, let's say. That's one way we are helping. The other one is social media monitoring. So we are kind of following a number of Twitter accounts, and then try to see what is kind of the sentiment or the needs that are being expressed by the people on the ground and the people affected, because this gives, let's say, additional insight into what is maybe important. The third way will be really more hands-on. For example, the International Federation of the Red Cross will deploy the shelter cluster. So people from our team will most likely be, or at least one person from our team might be deployed as an information manager. So then he will be really, or he or she will be on the ground and helping to manage all the information flows during the shelter operations. That gives me a bit an overview of what we're currently doing.
Thank you. I don't know, Burcu, if you want to go next, but also others, like, feel free to jump in and just comment. I saw David, looking as if you want to say something a couple of times, but yeah. Okay. You want to go first? And then we do Burcu. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. This is a political disaster. The explanation of it is political and the solution is political. There are two very interesting maps. The first is the hazard map, which was drawn by hand in 1967 and turned out to be substantially accurate. The second is the USGS acceleration map. Now, on the latter, there are some areas of high acceleration. Maximum was 1.61 G. But much of the epicentral area, the acceleration was at or less than 0.6 G, which should be survivable with adequate application of building codes. Turkey has had building codes for a very long time. In the last 55 years, they've been revised 5 times, and the 2018 revision was a very good one. Of course, building codes are not retrospective necessarily. I believe that there's a tax on mobile phone usage for the last 20 years that is intended to go to funding, retrofitting, and seismic improvements in building stock. I also believe that it has been siphoned off and also misused. If you look at many of the pictures of buildings that have collapsed, they have totally lost structural integrity. A well-engineered building, even if it does totally collapse, will produce void spaces to an extent of about 15%. If you look at many of the pictures of buildings that have collapsed, there are virtually no void spaces at all because there's been total disintegration, and that includes a hospital. The president of Turkey says that he wants to rebuild thousands of homes in 1 year. Well, that's a very bad idea indeed. In the first place, it would take about 2 years to do geotechnical surveys and urban planning, and that's an absolute minimum. After which there should be public consultation on the plans. So it's unlikely that any reasonable reconstruction could even get it underway in less than 3 years, and probably would take a good 4 years to get underway and about 25 years to complete. The penalty for not doing it properly is to put aside problems that will then come back and bite you when the next earthquake comes along, or possibly other environmental problems will supervene as a result. So what I think is needed is to agitate for better control and to make use of disaster science intended as the more rigorous application of emergency preparedness, planning, management, response and recovery. I think we really have to advocate for that. And I think there's a very strong risk indeed that this simply won't happen in this case. There's nothing I can say about Syria because with a war in force, I don't think there's much that can be done at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody want to go to maybe directly?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Burcu Balçık. I am a professor at Özyeğin University in Istanbul. I have been working in the area of humanitarian operations and disaster management for a while. Sibel summarized the situation very well, but since the beginning of disaster, I have been thinking that we should change the definition of natural and man-made disasters as a community, and I have been thinking this is not a natural disaster. A big part of it is due to the ignorance of authorities and other regulations. First of all, there shouldn't have been this damage, despite that it was a very significant event. There are cities with no collapsed buildings in the area. Not a single building was collapsed. And on the other hand, there are buildings which were newly made, like last year or 6 months ago, they are smashed, like they are completely destroyed, which shows that it is not about the age of buildings or the standards, and so the ignorance of authorities in applying the building standards and codes. This was one factor. Another one is very valuable times for saving human lives were lost. For the first 2 days, and like search and rescue was totally uncoordinated and not effective. There were many teams and a lot of attention from the public and community, like people use their hands to save the lives of their relatives and family. But we are now hearing stories like there were teams but no permission to intervene, or there were teams but no equipment. People waited, like people who could save lives waited there so long, and since the weather was too cold, the first night, like most of the people probably were dead because of cold weather and information system. Another important issue. It was very fragmented, and there were lots of tools and initiatives after the disaster because nobody knew that we were this not prepared. And there are all these initiatives, of course, which is nice. But since, I mean, even us, which we are not at the scene, it is too much information. There are like at least 5 tools. It says that we are the integrated tool that gives information about the disaster and the situation of aid, which is of course not very effective at the moment, which we just hope that these tools may turn into something more systematic for future, like there is an initiative now. Maybe some NGOs on the field are using some tools, but there is no unified system. There are a lot of needs, of course, for the medium term and long term. There are lots of issues to discuss. Education and needs is something that government decided to use university dormitories for shelter. And they decided that universities can do online education for the spring semester for an undetermined time. There's lots of protests for this because there are all these hotels or guest houses or there can be some areas built to accommodate people, and university dormitories are not sufficient, they are not equipped to hold people for a long time. And education should not be sacrificed. We need it most, and due to pandemics, these students are already away from universities for almost 2 years, and another year we cannot handle that. We don't know still what will happen, and next week whether we will be teaching online or what will happen. So that's something which is current at the time, for the time being. Also, hygiene, shelter, and public health issues are currently being discussed in the region, because of the dead bodies, which are under the rubble, there will be a lot of issues and diseases, which will, I think, which is becoming an important issue. Another issue is that the vulnerable populations, the villages could not be reached. There are, people with chronic health conditions, disabled or old people, elderly, we don't know what is happening to them. As a university, we are, for example, we have a project, we are developing some projects and amputated children. There are lots of children who are orphaned now, and also who lost their arms and legs, and maybe the engineers, we are trying to build a team of robotic engineers, what to do with them, and also how to engage these students, to children, to sports, maybe those long-term. We are thinking about these things, and also the private sector also, I should also talk about that maybe as side information. So private sector help was not coordinated. They helped a lot, but it was just uncoordinated, let me say. Maybe I can get into that in details. And also lots of small and medium-sized businesses in the area, they are just completely shut down. The socio-economic conditions of the region will be vulnerable for a very long time, and there will be a lot of internal displacement. The population of the region is 13 million. And the economic side, I think it is about 8 or 10% GDP is coming from the region. So we will see long-term economic effects of this disaster for years. For now, these are my notes. Maybe I can talk again if you have any questions about the region.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing. I think there's also a lot of very valuable points. I know that there's several researchers also in this Zoom room that have advocated no natural disasters, basically saying that a disaster is always created by a hazard event that meets a vulnerable population system that exploits a vulnerability. So indeed, the I think lack of preparedness, the vulnerability, and the inequality that are very prominent. And I would also like to stress that, for instance, in the scientific opinion, what you mentioned about education was put forward. They are very prominently making very clear that education is and should be considered as a critical infrastructure to avoid exactly that we are sacrificing education and the the future of young people because there are these adverse effects by disasters. Thank you. And maybe Eija, you also want to say quickly something to this point before I go to Dirk and Enrico.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much. I'm mostly here to perhaps hear the Turkish and other colleagues working in the field and sort of would want to understand what EU and EU countries and researchers based there could actually do to sort of perhaps at least draw focus on the right things. And I think the kind of ideas of, social vulnerabilities and inequalities have been raised, and also David raised the kind of questions of urban planning and what that would mean. So perhaps I don't go to that, but something that I asked in the chat from Burcu and others as well, that would be interesting to hear your reflections on what can EU countries and EU researchers do to actually draw attention perhaps to this deconstruction and natural disaster, and especially these what kind of politics can be put out or pushed for that would actually address in the long term the inequalities and the sort of planning, because of course this is not internal politics when it comes from EU countries. So it's what might be supportive, what could be helpful.
It's a good question, but hard to answer. I don't know how EU can affect Turkish in terms of politics or anything. I don't know that as an academic, but obviously we have, even if there are standards, they are not applied. We should establish some standards in constructing this new area. For example, one city is completely destroyed and it will be rebuilt. The transparency and accountability issues are always important. Anything that can be done to push authorities to be more transparent and accountable in the recovery process. I don't know the actions, but this is a need. And research-wise, I think it would be nice to, we are already involved in some projects. We are becoming partners to EU-funded projects, but maybe there are some calls, there are some ongoing calls for for May or next year. There are some EU Horizon calls associated with disaster preparedness and response, including making it easier for Turkish universities and researchers to become partners, and with cases from this area, maybe it would facilitate learning more from this disaster and getting prepared for the future expected disasters like Istanbul earthquake. It's a nightmare already thinking about it. I can think of these for now.
Thank you. I saw I'm now struggling. Nicole, can you wait a bit, or is it immediately to Burcu? Okay, then I will start with Dirk.
I'm just in the queue. I'm queuing.
Okay, Very good.
Perhaps you could give me the co-host rights to allow me to share.
I can't, but Toby can.
You should have it now, Dirk, if you try to share now.
All right, I'll do. So do you see my slides?
Yes, we see them.
It's many.
Yes, okay. So unfortunately, the earthquake in Turkey.
But I think we still see your speaker's view. So we also see San Francisco.
Okay, so I'll swap displays. So this way?
Fine.
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right, so unfortunately, this earthquake in Turkey and Syria is not the first one. And in fact, we've seen many earthquakes before. Among them, the big earthquake in San Francisco in 1906 and many others. And of course, there are not only dramatic pictures about those terrible events, but also actually a lot of learnings that we could make from those previous disasters. And over here, you see a so-called causality network that illustrates how one thing causes other problems in the society and economy. And basically, as bad as this is, it also allows you to take some preparatory measures in order to be proactive in what needs to be done. But that requires preparation. This is a chapter in the book Extreme Events in Nature and Society, and that title also underlines that we have to see extreme events in connection with society. In fact, it's not only a natural disaster, it's also a political and societal disaster, as is clearly illustrated by the fact that some cities have not been struck in the earthquake area, and others have been, and that's largely, apparently, a result of corruption. I'd like to mention also another example, which has been seen as a natural disaster, largely, the Fukushima disaster, but the official report stated that the earthquake and tsunami that was responsible for the nuclear meltdown was actually not the main cause, but our reflexive obedience, our reluctance to question authority. And so that has basically inspired some of our research, which has been geared towards participatory resilience. It means, what can people do? Not just authorities or the military or some top-down action. And many of the slides I've shown are back from 2014, when we organized a hackathon in San Francisco with the title, "What if the big one hits?" And I've learned a lot from that hackathon. Actually, it moved me to tears because within just 3 days, we've learned so much from each other. So in fact, there are new tools that become available through, on the one hand, digital technology, but on the other hand, also collective sensing and action. So for example, it's possible to create a platform that would send early warnings to friends and family members whenever in some area an earthquake starts shaking the ground. That's not the only thing that happens. I would give people a few extra seconds to get into a safe place potentially, but also smartphones can be used for crisis mapping. Also when the situation is clouded. So basically, if you have the right kind of platform, people can actually collect information and put it into a map. And there were 3 winning projects of that hackathon that I'd like to mention. One of them was called Amigo Cloud, which is exactly providing such a platform to collect information, take pictures, add annotations, and upload it to a platform. So everyone, including first aid, and the government would get a quick overview of the situation locally, also in areas that are hardly accessible. Second of all, there was Charge Beacon that proposed a system which was decentralized and providing people an opportunity to charge their smartphone so communication could be upheld also when the main communication and electricity system was down. And finally, there was Helping Hands that offered an app where people could basically say what was the kind of help they needed, and others could actually provide that help. And that's a platform that helps coordinate action and support, such that the first 8 units of the government could focus on the most affected areas, and otherwise people could help each other. Also in that connection, it's worthwhile thinking about ad hoc networks in case the normal communication system breaks down, which is often the case in disasters. And if that is well done, it's possible actually to have communication over an extended period of several days. I'd like to mention finally that also these participatory platforms can help also to address other challenges such as the spread of diseases and also sustainability challenges. So when it comes to solving problems that humanity is faced with, we should also think about how can we empower people to make a contribution and to help themselves and help each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, maybe you can stop sharing, then we can see each other again.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And I think, you know, of course, we also stress in all 3 reports the need for localization, participation, ownership. The big crux, especially with information, I think that was also already mentioned by our Turkish colleagues, is that there are so many platforms and all of them are called integrated, right? And it's, of course, you know, people will, so if there is a disaster and then there is a void, there is no assistance yet, and we heard that that happened again in Turkey, then of course they will self-organize, right? They will start doing things. And then it is about how can we support them, and how can we tailor also the assistance in a way that supports them, and how can we connect the information and information systems that are in use, because with all of these apps, you know, people will unlikely go to the App Store and download new apps if there is a disaster. So that's why some of the traditional, you know, like WhatsApp networks or other ones have been very, very popular. Facebook initiatives, of course, not if social media is shut down, then it becomes difficult. But so the crux is always how are we inclusive in collecting all that information, and how do we combine and collate that information so that the people who are also already overloaded, we heard that as well, can find easily and retrieve the information that they need in their very specific situation. And that is a super hard part. I also see somebody from the JRC is joining us as well, and I will give you the floor. I would like to give you the floor. I hope you will say something after Enrico and Nicole, maybe also about your approach and how you deal with these issues and in your analysis. But you know, after having heard that, I know long waiting time in the queue. So next is Enrico.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Enrico Zio from École des Mines Paris in France and Politecnico di Milano. I'm an energy engineer, typically working on resilience and risk of critical infrastructures and safety critical systems. I don't have a presentation, so it's hard to speak now after the beautiful presentation, interesting presentation. It's very, of course, very sad that we're talking always after the math and figuring out what to do. It seems to me that we're putting on the table the ingredients of the evidence report that we have done, because we're talking about all the things that we have already pointed out in the evidence report. But what leaves me a little bit, I would say, unsatisfied is what then? I mean, because what do we do? What can we do? Because the problem eventually is political. And the first question that comes to my mind is, whose problem is it? Because if it's a problem of the world, because it is a problem of the world, it's certainly a problem of Europe, okay? Then Europe must find a way, and there are political ways to do this, to really take action to prepare for the next one also, okay? In terms of prevention, in terms of codes for building, or needs to be put in terms, and in terms of preparing as preparing to face the aftermath of such a natural and human crisis, including deciding how to handle the borders, including deciding and equipping for resilience and recovery and all that. So, I mean, we can discuss as long as we want and come back to all the ingredients in the report, but some actions must be done at the right level in order to fill the gap, because that's the brought up already, to fill the gap between our very interesting and beautiful academic work and decision-making models and simulation models and data exchange apps and models and being able to actually use them in practice, being educated, also having built the culture of resilience and all of this. So I think we need to move up to the next step of taking action somehow. I don't know how, but I think that's what's needed. Otherwise, the ingredients, we have them, and we think we have them, and we put them in the pot, and then from my side, I will be cooking a nice minestrone, being from Milan. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's also a very nice segue to Nicole, just also point. So I'm also very mindful of the time. I know we are already at or beyond the time available, but I think it was a very insightful conversation. Going forward.